Today we're going to be talking about how to unleash the strengths of the product trio and how we're going to use design thinking to do that. So yeah, with that, let's just jump in. So quick agenda. First, we're going to talk about the product trio and how the product trio actually ties in and pairs really well with the four big risks associated with product management. Then we're going to be talking about how to utilize the product trio in every step of the design thinking process. And then we're going to be diving deeper into design thinking with how to effectively customer interview with the product trio, and then synthesize that information and then assess the impact and feasibility and tie it all back to those four risks. So let's talk about risk. This is it's a topic often shied away from. I know actually the previous session, it was actually talked about there, and I thought that was amazing. But one of our core jobs as product managers is to mitigate against risk all the time. And so what are the four risks? This is actually, it came from a 2017 article written by Marty Cagan. He also talked about it in his book Inspired. But the four big risks of product management, first of all, is value risk. Whether our customers will buy it and our users will choose to use it. And in enterprise software, especially, our customers and our users might be totally different people, right? So we have to assess both the risk of our customers wanting to buy the product and our users actually wanting to use that product. And then that leads into usability risk. How can our users actually figure out how to use it, right? Is it easy to use? And then feasibility risk, whether we as the product team can actually build it and execute upon it with the time, skills, and technology that are accessible to us, right? I mean, for instance, if we don't have, if we want to build a machine learning product, but we don't have a machine learning engineer, we don't have the skill, right? So that is a huge risk factor there. And then lastly is business viability risk. And OKRs have been mentioned quite a bit. I know in Jana's talk, she mentioned OKRs. If what we're trying to build doesn't fit with our core objective or our core mission or our core strategy, that there's a risk that might disrupt our business, right? So how does this tie in with the product trio, right? So I've seen a lot of companies with the variation of either the product manager and the product designer, or the product manager and the engineer, or in very few cases, fortunately, the product manager alone, finding problems, coming up with solutions, and then passing them over the fence to, either the engineering team or the design team who, wasn't in the room when they were finding those problems and coming up with those solutions. This leads to so many problems. When someone who's responsible for the execution of the product doesn't understand the customer and their problems, there's an incredibly high risk of that solution not being correct. I'm going to say that again. When someone who's responsible for the execution of the product doesn't understand the customer and their problems, there is an incredibly high risk of that solution not being correct. This is where the product trio comes into play. And so the product trio is made up of a product manager, a designer, and then the lead engineer. And the reason why I love this concept is that it distributes accountability in the name. It distributes the accountability across the core team responsible for the success of the product. How? Because every level of risk is now accounted for. The product manager, for instance, is responsible for the value risk, right? Will our customers actually want to use it, and will they buy it, right? The product designer is responsible for the usability risk. If a product needs so much documentation and people are spending 50% of their time in the documentation and not, actually trying to use and figure out the product, it's probably not that easy to use, right? So we need the product designer to actually be there with us in the room. And then the lead engineer responsible for the feasibility risk. And so this is this could be argued, but I put business viability risk actually as a responsibility for the team. It could be argued that the product manager themselves is responsible for the business viability risk, but I really think that going back to actually Marty Cagan's book, right? If you're a missionary, if you're an employee of the company versus a mercenary, right? Just a contractor or somebody who's consulting, right? You should have the business's best interests at heart always. So if you're a missionary, the business viability risk is also on you. So business viability is a team sport for sure. I'll tell a quick story. A company that I consulted for was actually struggling to understand this concept. They thought that the product trio fit more in with some type of like research or R&D department, and not on the core teams. At this company, the product manager and the designer would work together on a solution and then hand off the requirements to development. And then they would be shocked when development said, like, well, actually, we can't develop this in the timeline that you want. Like, we would need so much more time. And so I also learned through that the engineers had very little knowledge of what the customer was actually using the product for and what value it actually provided to the end consumer. And so I had to explain to them that the current process that we had was kind of broken, and that this would ultimately decrease the risk of running into those feasibility handoff issues, and our engineers would actually really understand how our users were actually using the product. And so this is when we actually decided to implement trios and run design thinking sessions with that. So design thinking, I'm sure a lot of people are probably familiar with design thinking. You have the empathize phase where you're really trying to discover those problems of the customers. And then you have define where you're kind of synthesizing that information, and then ideate where you're coming up with ideas. And then, you're sort of always circling back to that customer, right? You're trying to say like, hey, did I hear that right? Did I define the problem correctly? And then when you're ideating solutions, did we come up with a good idea that we might want to move into the prototyping phase and then test it out with you, right? Every step of design thinking should have the product trio in it. When we get into the customer interview, going back to that example, the company that I consulted with, when we first implemented the product trio, I had engineers coming up to me and saying like, well, I don't want to be in the room with the customer. I don't want to talk to them. I'm terrified of actually talking to them. And so, it's so important to actually level set on the responsibilities, before you even start talking to customers, because, people could have completely different, understandings of what's responsible and what they're responsible for versus what you're responsible for. So I like to make it clear and set the objective with my team and say, hey, I'll do the main questioning of the customers. But we have to have some type of open communication where, sometimes we have like a Slack or you can ping me in Zoom privately, if you have some type of question, but I'll just say like, hey, I'll do the majority of the talking. But the last thing is like, we actually do need to help each other out on these customer interviews, right? If I get a question, back to me and I don't have the answer, I told that engineer, right? Like, I might need you to jump in and say like, hey, this is a feasibility related issue. Like I'm not the best person to talk about this. So, I'm going to have my engineer answer that. And then if they might ping me on the side and say, hey, I can't answer that question. Like, so I'll just say, I'll get back to you. I'll go back to the team and just email you after the fact. So after you synthesize all that information from the customer interview, you want to be able to put all those statements and all of those problems that you heard into the jobs to be done format. And I know this has definitely happened with me. I kind of want a show of hands in the audience. How many people have felt that their product team, whether it's engineering or design or other stakeholders, they just don't seem to care about why they're building what they're building? So this is why the jobs to be done framework, I love it, because when we're synthesizing all of that information, when the engineer is in the room or the designer is in the room, and we're all, using Figma Jam or Miro or whatever, and putting our job statements on sticky notes, they really start to understand, oh, this is what the customer actually like wants to do. This is the outcome that they want. So a typical job statement is just, when I do something, I want to accomplish a task so that I get some type of outcome. So for instance, when I go running, I want to listen to music so that I stay entertained throughout my run. And so, I know this is super small, and I do have these templates available on my website. After we get all of our job statements, we want to figure out where those map out in the customer interview. Or sorry, we want to map out all of those job statements on the customer journey map of when they're occurring. And then we want to also figure out sort of the pain points and the gains to sort of assess, like, okay, what are like the real negative feelings that people have associated with those jobs. And then after that, we can start to figure out, like, okay, how are we going to, as a team, solve those together? And so that's when we bring in how might we. And so when we bring in how might we, we're actually taking those jobs with those big pain points, and then we're reframing them as questions. So for instance, with that job statement, how might we enable a way to listen to music without our earbuds falling out so that runners can stay entertained throughout their run? And so when I run these sessions of how might we with the product trio, what I typically start out with is coming up with the worst possible idea to solve the problem, because it really opens up everybody's creativity and sort of their innovation thinking, because you've already thrown out whatever the worst possible idea can be. So every idea after that is going to be better. And that's sort of where we get into the impact and assessing the feasibility of these ideas, because some ideas might be awful, and that's okay. We're trying to rapidly ideate and get as many ideas out there as possible, and then we can go put them on this impact feasibility matrix, and quickly dismiss the bad ones that might be that big feasibility risk, or they might introduce a huge usability risk. So we want to get rid of the bad ones and then focus on the ones that could be those more so low hanging fruit. With the feasibility risk is super low. The business viability risk is non-existent, because we've already assessed, okay, it maps with our core objective. So we definitely want to get all of those ideas on the impact feasibility matrix, and then after the fact, we want to bring that back to the customer and say, like, hey, these are our ideas. Would these work for you? And again, the product trio is involved every step of this way. And so that's about it. Just to summarize, we talked about decreasing risk by distributing the accountability across the product trio. We talked about bringing that product trio into every aspect of design thinking, and then we really want to find the ideas worth exploring and assessing that impact and feasibility, and then tying it back to how it will mitigate against all of those four big risks. And so, yeah, let's stay connected. this is where to find me. And then the templates that I just shared are available on my website at that link. And then, yeah, two resources there, the Marty Cagan article, and then Teresa Torres introduced the product, the concept of the product trio. Marty Cagan also talked about it in his book Inspired, but he didn't put that name, the product trio, around it. So yeah, are there any questions?
So I just wanted to mention, this is Miriam, the moderator. We're really fortunate to have about 10 minutes for questions. So definitely encourage people to delve into the experiences here.
So Aaron, I'll ask a question.
For sure, yeah.
If this concept is new to your organization, how do you encourage leadership to try it, right? To see if it works inside your organization. So how would you strategize to sell the idea of product trios?
Yeah, so at that company that I consulted for, I mean, we had numerous talks with leadership, and one of the things that we also did was I guess it was a little bit behind the scenes, but me as the product manager, I was a huge proponent for this. So I met with like a lot of our lead designers and our lead engineers, and I sort of pitched them the idea of, this could be the value that we get from the product trio, right? And I shared with them these resources of, the Teresa Torres article and the Marty Cagan article, and this was before I started my blog. So and then I created a presentation that said, this is what we could do with it. So I got the buy-in from the core team members that I needed on my side. And then I brought it to leadership and said, like, hey, if we do this, we already have the trios, we've already broken into trios. We just need your go ahead, right? I think that's a good way to do it, right? If you can get the core buy-in of the core team that's going to be doing the trio work, getting leadership's approval for it is going to be sort of, I would say pretty easy. But what are your hesitations, I guess?
So it's just a new concept in an organization already starting to move from waterfall to agile, right? So there's so much going on, but there really is a lot of benefit. It's just giving it shelf space and conversation space, I think is where I see the biggest hurdle. There's so much other change. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I appreciate it.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Hey, Aaron, it's Vishal here. Thank you for this great topic. I definitely completely understand and completely, sold on this concept. I think it's very powerful in my opinion. But I also noticed that sometimes some engineers and, they are not interested in really getting involved in these kind of a discussion. They are more like that. Give me the requirement, what you want, I will build it. I'm not interested. I'm pretty sure that you're nodding your head. So you may have experienced this thing. Do you have any suggestion there? How, you handle those situations? Especially I'm talking about the team where, you are working with the team, which is not really closer to your customer, like they are in some kind of a remote location overseas, and their cultural differences there. So there are many kind of obstacles there. Even, we product managers sometimes try to engage them in those conversations and trying to understand from the customer point of view. But they say, no, give me your user story, I will build it.
Yeah. I mean, this is actually a constant, thing that I see with engineering teams is like, they don't, it's nothing wrong with them. It's just that they want to just focus on the task at hand, right? They want to, really dive deep into the code, right? And so that's where I think the jobs to be done format actually does help out with that, where if we get the engineering team and the design team in the room together, where we're all coming up with job statements, they'll really start to understand and really start to think, further out of like, oh, this is what the actual customer is trying to do with the product, right? And so their code actually gets better because they start to think more in terms of like, what does a user actually want to do versus I need to develop this ticket, right? At least from my experience. I mean, what would you say to that, Vishal?
I definitely think it's probably a good idea, and maybe that can help, but I will definitely try to use this format. I'm aware of this format, but I think I'm going to be a little bit more sort of a religious in terms of using this one. So let's see how it goes, but thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I would say just get the team involved, right? I mean, yes, product managers or whatever should write user stories, all of that stuff, right? But that shouldn't stop an engineer from saying, hey, I can write a user story, or I can think about how a user would want to do this, right?
Yeah.
So
good point. Thank you, sir.
For sure. Yeah.
We have a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah.
I'll read the first one out. Matt Bettina asks, what in your experience have been some of the biggest stumbling blocks for product trios getting started throughout the process over time? And how do you recommend tackling these?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say the biggest stumbling block that I guess I've experienced is that people don't want to waste other people's time. So they think, oh, well, we don't need that engineer in the room, or we don't need the designer in the room. Let's just talk about it like real quick. I don't want to get on their schedule or take them away from what they're working on, right? That is a discipline that I think really needs to be, accounted for. Of anytime we're talking about what the customer is actually trying to do or the solution for that customer, you need to have the product trio in the room. I think that's probably one of the biggest hurdles because, I think we're so used to just getting into the room with whoever we think needs to be there versus like making that discipline throughout all of, every one of the meetings. And it does take some discipline because sometimes, I have an engineer put a calendar invite on or a meeting invite on my calendar, and I actively have to think, okay, who else should be there? So that's kind of what I think the biggest stumbling block that I've seen, at least.
Great. So we have, thank you for addressing that. We have a couple more in the chat, and we have maybe 3 minutes. So let's take a look and see. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, for sure.
Great. So Andy DeRoin, I'm not sure which, but how might you see this working in a small startup environment where roles are less defined and responsibilities overlap?
Yeah. Also a great question. So I guess, Andy, if you could clarify. So I guess what I'm going to assume is that a lot of people, like for instance, the product manager also might be, for instance, doing some of the design work, or, might be jumping in with even engineering work. Is that correct?
Sorry, I started typing in the chat, and I was like, I can unmute. We're so small that we don't actually even have a true PM.
Okay.
And we're outsourcing a lot of our technical talent. So we're that tiny. So
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would say that, definitely just get as many people in the room as possible, or, figure out the trios in a different way where, if one person wants to be responsible for the value, right? How are we delivering value to the customer, or that it's going to be useful, right? then distribute the responsibilities in whatever the core team's sort of function should be at that moment, right? Like if you want to assign somebody to be like, okay, I'm going to be responsible for the usability right now, and I'm going to be responsible for the value, and then you might be responsible for the technical feasibility. That could be a way of doing that, where you just partner with different people and distribute the product trio functionalities that way, and mitigate the risks in that format. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay, so we're nearly at time. I did want to mention one other question that came up as a direct message. I think this, so I'm just going to read it out. So do you have an opinion on which role or team in the trio should lead design thinking session? In his org, the product team traditionally doesn't lead that time of meeting.
Yeah, that is a good question. I would say, I've typically led the design thinking sessions, but it could also be helpful to have an outside, product manager or somebody who's familiar with the framework lead them. I guess I'm talking more about the ideation sessions, like after you've done the interview. I would say typically, if you're talking about design thinking sessions where you're with a customer, I would say the product manager could absolutely lead those. You might also have a user researcher that's there, and they could absolutely lead them. But yeah, I would say by and large, the product manager should probably be the one leading the design thinking sessions. Sometimes the designer could as well, but I would also want their time focused more on how am I going to be thinking about solving and designing a good solution for the customer